Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're joining us today because we've got an absolutely fascinating and honestly a pretty crucial topic to break down. Today, June 15th, 2026, actually marks exactly 1 decade since that historic 2016 referendum that completely reshaped the United Kingdom. 10 years on, the dust has finally settled enough for us to see the whole picture. So we're skipping the political rhetoric today and diving right into the hard data to see exactly how this historic decision has impacted the everyday lives of the British people. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to do a full 360-degree audit of the past 10 years. We'll be looking at 10 years after the vote, the economic price tag, the immigration paradox, the unlikely winners, fragmented financial markets, and finally, a decade of regret.
All right, part 1, 10 years after the vote.
You know, it all really kicked off back in June 2016 with that razor-thin margin, literally just 51.9% of voters choosing to leave the European Union. But as we all remember, leaving didn't exactly happen overnight, right? It was followed by years of intense political wrangling, ultimately leading to the official exit and the end of that incredibly messy transition period around 2020 and 2021. That meant formally leaving the single market and the customs union, completely untangling decades of legal integration. Now, fast forward to 2026. We are living in the 10-year reality. We finally have the concrete data to measure the actual lived impact of those defining decisions.
Moving straight into part 2, the economic price tag. £4,000. Let that sink in for a second. According to the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, long-term GDP, which is basically the overall size and health of the economy, will permanently drop by 4% compared to a reality where the UK just stayed in the EU. And when you distill that massive macroeconomic percentage down to the individual everyday level, it means the average British household is projected to be $4,000 worse off by 2030. That is a tangible, very real hit to living standards that fundamentally changes household budgets across the entire country. But honestly, you don't even have to wait until 2030 to feel the pinch. 30%, that is how much food prices alone have surged since the 2016 vote. It's wild. New trade barriers, heavy red tape at the borders, supply chain frictions, they've all squeezed sectors like food imports directly. Every extra veterinary check on imported meat, every delay at the port, every single piece of new customs bureaucracy adds a hidden premium. And guess who pays for it? Yep, it gets passed directly onto the consumer at the supermarket checkout. And this brilliantly illustrates the wider issue. Former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, just hit the nail on the head regarding the scale of this economic contraction. He said, in 2016, the British economy was 90% the size of Germany's. Now it is less than 70%. I mean, the scale of that shift over a single decade is absolutely staggering. In fact, Bloomberg Economics estimates that the annual drag on the UK economy caused by all this friction is currently sitting somewhere between £100 billion and £200 billion every single year. The compounding effect of that lost growth is massive. Looking at the wider projections, the UK is expected to have 3 million fewer jobs by 2035. A solid decade of political and trade uncertainty has also caused business investment to plummet by 18%, leaving the UK with the absolute lowest investment rate in the G7. Businesses are literally just holding back capital. But here is the ultimate, kind of fascinating irony. Despite leaving the EU to supposedly reduce state burdens and regulation, the need to fund deeply stretched public services during a period of lower growth has actually caused UK tax rates to rise, jumping from 31% of GDP to 37%. So in terms of the overall tax burden, the UK has actually become much more European since leaving the European Union. Let's look at Section 3, the immigration paradox. Now, what's really interesting about this is that taking back control of the borders was arguably the central promise of the Leave campaign. Yet when free movement ended, the UK saw a massive demographic swap. There was a dramatic drop of 785,000 European Union workers who either packed up and left or just never arrived. But to keep the economy running, the government had to issue a record number of visas to workers from outside the EU. Non-EU workers surged by 992,000. So instead of overall immigration falling, the UK actually saw a net increase of over 200,000 foreign-born workers. The total number went up. The geographic origin of that labor just shifted globally. And practically speaking, this paradox plays out most vividly right inside the National Health Service. The sudden end of EU free movement triggered an urgent, massive hiring boom to fill chronic, honestly dangerous shortages in the NHS and social care sectors. The UK essentially opened its doors wide to highly skilled doctors and nurses from countries like India, Egypt, Nigeria, and the Philippines. In fact, today, Indian medical staff in England actually outnumber their European counterparts. It is a profound demographic shift that perfectly captures the unexpected, lived realities of post-referendum policy. Which brings us to part 4, the unlikely winners. So, with all this disruption, who actually benefited? Because in any structural economic shift, there are always entities that find an edge, right? First up, customs agents. The absolute mountain of new red tape required the training of 10,000 new agents just to handle the immense volume of border paperwork. Then there's Northern Ireland. Thanks to the very highly debated Windsor framework, it uniquely retained access to both the UK and EU markets, and the result of having access to both, a 3% higher income growth compared to the rest of the UK. We also saw a massive boom in Dutch logistics. South Holland became the go-to hub for corporate refugees, with 66 UK firms moving their distribution centers straight across the channel to entirely bypass those border restrictions. Finally, the AI and agritech sectors found an edge. Free from strict EU regulations, the UK created flexible regulatory sandboxes. This attracted €127 million in alternative protein research and saw tech giants like Meta and Apple eagerly rolling out new AI features in the UK way before the rest of Europe.
All right, moving on to Section 5, fragmented financial markets.
Now, London and Europe still remain a deeply, fundamentally interconnected ecosystem. Even today, over 80% of European derivatives still clear right through London. But the loss of deep regulatory integration has created very real, very expensive friction across the entire financial sector. Without the EU banking passport, cross-border operations are vastly more complicated. They require duplicate compliance teams, more paperwork, the whole shebang. And this isn't just a headache for wealthy bankers and skyscrapers. This friction hits everyday consumers hard. The loss of UK-EU payments integration led directly to significantly higher interchange fees on cross-border credit card transactions. So for regular people just buying things online or traveling for a holiday, the cost of transacting simply went up.
And finally, Section 6, a decade of regret?
10 years. It's a long time. It's enough time for the dust to settle, for campaign promises to be tested against reality, and for the actual consequences to be lived by the voting public. And public opinion? Well, it has shifted dramatically over this decade, leading to a phenomenon that's widely been dubbed Brexit. Currently, a solid 55% of the British public say they regret the decision, while only 32% still firmly support it. Polling consistently reveals that nearly half the public feels the exit is going objectively worse than they expected. And in a pretty surprising political twist, even 1/5 of the voters from the heavily pro-Brexit Reform Party now state they would support a second referendum. But honestly, the most crucial data point for the future of the United Kingdom is probably this one: 80%. There is a massive, defining generational divide on this issue. A staggering 80% of 16 to 24-year-olds, many of whom were literally just children when the 2016 vote took place, say they would support rejoining the European Union today. They're looking at the economic reality they're inheriting, and their sentiment is loud and clear. This demographic reality means the debate over Britain's relationship with Europe is absolutely 100% far from settled.
So it leaves us with this massive looming question. If untangling the UK from the EU over the last 10 years was this immensely complicated, this deeply messy, and let's face it, this economically damaging, what on earth would it actually cost to try and put the pieces back together? Because rejoining wouldn't just be a simple reversal, right? It would involve negotiating completely from scratch without any of the UK's previous special opt-outs or budget rebates. It is a huge question for the next decade of British politics. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive clarified exactly what the data tells us about the real impact over the last 10 years. Be sure to check out our other data-driven explainers, and I will see you next time.